Now, having just sort of downplayed the importance of capital intensity for long run growth, long run, medium run growth, or sort of moderately long run growth, 10, 20, 30 years, rather than 30, 40, 50, 100 years, do depend on capital investments in physical and human capital. And so we might look at what government policies could boost that medium to moderately long run growth. So, of course, one thing we might go is that, well, countries need to invest, they need to build up their capital stock, and there is an argument that some countries, because they are very poor, can't save enough to invest and grow their capital stock. I personally am pretty skeptical of that argument. If you look at countries like Japan or China, they managed to have very high savings rates even when they were very poor. Other countries, the United States, say for instance, has a fairly low savings rate even though it's one of the richest countries in the world. So, again, I'm pretty darn skeptical that it's impossible for low-income countries to save. I think it's very likely entirely possible for low-income countries that have the right economic institutions and the right culture to save and self-finance their own development. But let's suppose we have a country that is not able to save or not willing to save and self-finance its own investments and growth. What can it go ahead and do? Of course, it can borrow from overseas. And of course, the U.S. does this even though we are a rich country already. And of course, there's two ways a country can borrow from overseas. One is the obvious way, and that's what we call foreign portfolio investment, so that someone who wants to build a factory in, say, Argentina borrows money from a bank in Switzerland or something, builds their factory in Argentina, and there we go. So again, the investment is financed by foreign money, but it's built and operated by domestic residents. And one attraction then is this sort of preservation of domestic control, and you can see why that might be politically attractive. A disadvantage is that because the investment itself is monetary, rather than sort of permanently fixed in place, the foreign investor can possibly demand early repayment and precipitate a financial crisis. Economists actually generally think foreign direct investment is more beneficial, and I think this goes against maybe people's popular political opinions here. It's probably better for the Argentine economy if, say, if a German company comes and builds a factory in Argentina rather than a German bank lending money to an Argentine investor. And the reason why that is twofold. One is that once the German company has built the factory in Argentina, it can't sort of instantly pull things out if it gets a little bit scared about Argentina's political or economic prospects. The factory is there physically, and the German company is not going to be able to pull it out and precipitate a financial crisis if it gets scared. The second thing is, when there is foreign management of a domestic production facility, often there's a lot of transmission of technology and know-how and good ways to run a business and so on and so forth. And those may actually be even more important than the investment in the factory itself. And if you sort of think about it, if Toyota is coming and expanding its production in the United States, the reason why that is because Toyota is a really successful car company. They do things really well. And arguably for a long time, maybe even up till today, do things better than the American car companies do. And that's why they were beating the pants off them for a long time. And so it benefits the United States to have foreign management come and run those factories so that American workers can learn how to do things the Toyota way. And we gain some human capital and some technology when that happens. This, again, is probably not the way most people look at it, whereas most people think, foreign companies are running things and we should have American-owned businesses and so on and so forth. And that's definitely understandable on a political and emotional level. But if we really want to get ahead, we shouldn't be afraid to learn from other countries that may know how to do things better. What about human capital? Well, human capital is definitely an important part of growth, and it's probably true that certain types of technology only become usable when you have workers that have a certain level of human capital. What about more broadly? Well, the rate of return that we see on human capital looks like it's relatively substantial. Sort of, if we look at the levels of education, formal education that are likely to occur in the US, it looks like that 1 year of schooling is associated with about 10% higher wages. If we go out there and look at things like on-the-job experience, we would see that yes, every year that someone spends in the workforce, their wages are maybe about 3% higher on average than someone with one less year of experience in the workforce. So you can see that there are really important benefits to investments in human capital out there. I think I'd sort of say, one, we need to be really careful to remember that human capital is not just a matter of formal education, that a lot of times on-the-job training is an important form of human capital. And for less developed countries, or maybe even poorer regions of the United States, there sometimes gets to be a little bit of a tricky situation, where if you educate people in skills that the local economy does not know how to employ profitably, you may just end up educating people and then they migrate out of the area and then you lose their skills and you've spent a whole bunch of money educating them. So if we had a lot of training of electrical engineers in Humboldt County, well, there isn't really any industry that's going to make really good use of electrical engineers in Humboldt County. Maybe eventually some of those engineers might start up their own businesses that would make, computer chips or electronics or something like that. But at least at the current state of things, it's a little bit unsure whether or not Humboldt County would benefit from spending a lot of money training electrical engineers. I think we also just want to be a little bit careful when talking about human capital. Of course, many economists are academics, and they're going to, of course, have a very positive opinion of the value of education. It's what they devote a lot of their time to. And so there are a couple of theories out there that we want to make sure that we give some airtime. And a big one of them is what's called signaling theory. And the idea of signaling theory is that, of course, people are different, and some people have a high level of talent. They're just smart, and that's just the way it is. Or they have a higher level of work ethic or a higher ability to defer gratification. And if you think about that, getting an education is something that is a lot easier for someone who's smarter or is more able to defer gratification or has a higher work ethic. And all of those are valuable skills in the workplace. So it may be that essentially education is a kind of screening process. And it's a screening process that lets through people who are smart and or patient and or hardworking, and sort of tends to filter out people who are not as smart or patient or hardworking. And it might be that even if education didn't teach anything, that the filtering process itself would be valuable. My sort of example here would be, well, the person who's the meat inspector at a slaughterhouse isn't actually changing the quality of the meat, but it's still a valuable function because they're letting through a quality product and hopefully stopping a not so quality product out there, one that the consumer values less. Another one is that it's not so much that what we teach you in school, specifically as far as the particular books you read and the subjects you take and that sort of thing. It's that education mostly actually is a matter of sort of what we call soft skills, that you learn that, yes, you need to be able to show up at a particular place at a particular time and do things and read directions and work well with others and all those sorts of things. That ultimately are very valuable things out there in the labor force. This would still make education a value-adding process, but it's less a value-adding process about the actual lessons directly that you've learned out of the books and more what you've learned in terms of life skills by going through the educational process. Human capital, again, is not just education. It's not even just education and on-the-job training or skills. Education can include things like health and nutrition. And investments in health and nutrition may be not the hugest source of economic gains for an already developed economy, but for a poor economy, they really can be. Again, remember that people in poor economies are often suffering from high levels of malnutrition and disease. And, if someone is substantially malnourished and a lot of their labor is actually physical, then they're just not going to be very productive. They're not going to have the calories to do a full day's work. And even if they did have the calories to do a full day's work, they're going to be what we call stunted and wasted. They're going to be short and they're going to be extremely thin. And obviously, in our country, people don't have a problem with being too thin. And most people get enough calories to do a full day's work. We also would want to think about things like malaria. If we see that that workers in a country are not very productive, and we sort of look at that and go, oh, what's wrong with these people? Of course, if you had malaria and you were chronically malnourished, you wouldn't be very productive either. So it may be that the right investments in the health of the young population or the working age population can increase productivity in a poor country significantly. And even in the United States, you can certainly imagine that, yes, some people are having health issues that are impairing their productivity. At the most basic level, a policy that every government needs to have is basically to have some level of political stability and a reasonably clean government. Because essentially, if those two things aren't true, then nobody who's interested in starting a business or increasing their productivity in pie making is going to invest much effort into it, because some rebel army may come along and steal everything and burn everything to the ground and slaughter your cows and so on and so forth out there. Less obviously, when we don't have a reasonably stable society, the path to success and power is probably going to be through seizing control of the government or the secret police or something like that. As a sort of corollary of this, one of the things we want in sort of having a reasonably non-corrupt society is that the people who are sort of the current holders of economic power shouldn't be able to sort of block progress and innovations that threaten them. And this is actually something where already rich economies do run into some trouble, that there may be successful firms or successful occupations or groups of workers or corporate interests or something who may try to block innovations that would threaten the value of their current investments and status. And how exactly to deal with that is often a tricky question. In some ways, what we're talking about here is the stability of property rights. And when we start talking about property rights, a lot of times people say, well, what you're saying here is that every country has to be, capitalist and nothing can ever change and property rights are completely sacred and all that kind of stuff. And that's actually pretty obviously untrue. Every country out there has property rights that have evolved through time. So for instance, in many hunter-gatherer societies, private property rights and land aren't recognized because essentially land is very plentiful compared to the level of population. So we see that essentially it's not really worth it to try and figure out exactly who owns what particular piece of land. But as population densities grow, then land becomes more scarce, and social customs and laws and so on and so forth to regulate people's access to land start to become important. Or we might see something similar with respect to something like water. When the western United States was first settled, there was plenty of water to go around for everyone, and water rights were not particularly well tracked or enforced. But as population densities have grown, water has become more scarce, and it's become more important to establish systems for regulating access to water, which is, of course, a kind of property right. Or finally, for something like carbon dioxide. It may have been for a long time that the ability of the Earth to absorb carbon dioxide emissions was not something that was scarce. Everyone could go ahead and burn their little campfire, or, make a few tons of iron for the Roman legions or something, and it wasn't going to cause global climate change. But once we have high levels of industrialization, that means that the ability of the Earth to absorb that carbon dioxide now is a meaningful, scarce thing. And so we have to sort of figure out how to regulate access to that property. So obviously property rights evolve over time, and they have to evolve over time, because we have to keep track of what's scarce and don't need to worry about what's not scarce. The other thing to notice out there is that property rights themselves could be individual, as they often are in our society, or they could be at the level of a group. A commune or a co-op has property rights. We could imagine, a city has a property right. The city owns the park. It has property rights in that. So the idea that property rights should be stable and clear and reasonably protected is essentially the argument that we want to make it so that people or groups, whether individuals or companies or communes or cities, spend more time operating within an existing system, trying to figure out how to make more pie within the existing system, rather than trying to change the system to steal other people's pie. So again, clarity here is probably more important than exactly how we divide them up. Because once there's clarity and people know what the rules are, then they don't spend their time arguing about what the rules should be.